Welcome, folks. This is All-Minus-One, and I am Bill. Welcome to the show. Real quick before we get started, just to let those know who might be new, there are links in the description if you wish to watch elsewhere or to donate or, those kind of things. They're in the YouTube description, and they should be in the DLive subscription. Just up front, I'm probably not going to watch DLive. It's kind of hard for me to keep control the chat while I'm trying to read and stuff. And I run through StreamYards, and I can read YouTube. But the other one is Odyssey. Entropy. Odyssey is on my mind because it's the name of the song, the beginning there that I use. Entropy is a place where you guys can send super chats if you would like, and I'll check in over there from time to time. So that's pretty much it. So what are we talking about today? Well, today is Monday meditations, and I think I'm going to dedicate Mondays to talking about the church and early church stuff. And so we've been talking about anti-militarism of the early Christian church. I keep doing that, anti-Christian militarism. In any case, so we are going to talk about this old paper, The Basis of Early Christian Anti-Militarism. And I left off on page 12, but just because this section starts off at 11, I'm going to start there again today. So real quick, I see there's a couple of you in the chat. Anti-Commie says, this isn't something I can test, mind you. Militarism leads to jihadism. That's bad. Pacifism leads to genocide. Middle path. That's what I'm on about. Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's a matter of what does Christ command, and I think the church compromised itself later on, and they did that largely through Augustinian theology, which is based in Manichaean Stoic Gnosticism. So, and as far as how he is held up himself, Augustine, he is held up in the West with supremacy. It's basically him and Thomas Aquinas. These are guys writing in the 5th century or later. So I think Aquinas was in the 5th century. I think he was a contemporary of Augustine or Augustine, however you like to pronounce it. But regardless, I just have this burning question of why aren't we looking at the ante-Nicene period before the Council of Nicaea and how Christians acted. And that's where my heart is on these issues. So Thane says, almost done with work, machines keep breaking down. Yeah, that's how it goes, right? Entropy is the state of the world. All right, so let's get right into it. Last Monday, I read some other quotes and stuff, because again, I kind of wanted to preface this. The week before, I just read straight from this paper, and so this is primarily what we'll do today, and I'll throw in my 2 cents every now and again. Hopefully, we'll get through a little bit more of this than we did last week. So it says, the unpracticalness of the Christian position was vigorously urged by Celsus. Celsus was a Roman who was a critic of the early church, the famous anti-Christian writer of the 2nd century, and Origen deals with this point fully at the very close of his great reply. Celsus evidently believed that civilization rests on force, and that kings ruled by divine right, and that he challenged the Christians with the question as to what would happen if all the Romans were persuaded to adopt the principles of Christianity and show the same indifference to the military requirements of the government and the same refusal to worship the monarch. And this is also would be my first line of defense against the modern churches who suggest that monarchy is God's way. It is under Christ, but all of the monarchies that are all of the governments of the world today are under in the power of Satan. That is what Christ preached in the gospel. That's why he said, for the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, as it's written in Matthew, is at hand. That it was a tale of 2 kingdoms. And you really get this really comes through in John's gospel. because John makes an explicit point of it, and probably for the fact that it seems to be the consensus of most scholars that he wrote that much later in time. Now, some people think it was one of the earlier Gospels. I do not. I think John probably decided to write things down in his later life. And of course, we have that his letters, and by tradition, he's the one who wrote the book of Revelations, but people dispute that all the time. Regardless, the theme is quite clear. You either belong to the kingdom of Satan or you belong to the kingdom of God through Christ and his adoption into God's family. So, again, the early church, they were kind of indifferent and they would not worship monarchs. And monarchs have always been part of a ruling elite that has seen themselves as gods. We see nothing different today. Say the exact same thing today. I was watching Sitch and Adam yesterday, and they had Joe Neerman on from Good Logic, and they were addressing kind of why do you think the leftists let the elites or different people get away with things? Why do they uh, not care about their hypocrisy? And they threw out several theories, but it essentially does come down to they are elitist. I tell you all the time on here that when you hear people like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or anyone else, the Lincoln Project, whomever, it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans do it too, who go on and talk about our democracy and our democracy is in danger. They're talking about their democracy, their power, and their rule amongst each other. They're not talking about you folks. I can promise you that. Now, you might believe that, but that's not a that is not how they think of themselves. Trust me. I have been around plenty of these folks, even on the lower level, and they think that they are special. Um, and I know that mommy told all of us that we are special, unique snowflakes and all that, which bears true to some degree. But the reality is that they are just men. And for the most part, most of them are just lucky. They're lucky to have the proper support. They're lucky to be born into certain families. They are for sure hardworking in some ways, but for the most part, they have the right connections, and they're a special little club, and you ain't in it, right? Anyways, let's get back to the text. For he says, if all were to do the same as you, there would be nothing to prevent his being left in utter solitude and desertion, to prevent his being left in utter solitude and desertion. And the affairs of the earth would fall into the hands of the wildest and most lawless barbarians. And then there would no longer remain among men any of the glory of your religion, of the true wisdom. To this, Origen replies in part as follows. Would that all were to follow my example, in rejecting the maxim of Homer, maintaining the divine origin of the kingdom, and observing the precept of honor the king. In these circumstances, the king will not be left in utter solitude and desertion. Neither will the affairs of the world fall into the hands of the most impious and wild barbarians. For if, in the words of Celsus, they do as I do, then it is evident that even the barbarians, when they yield obedience to the word of God, will become most obedient to the law and most humane. And every form of religion will be destroyed except for the religion of Christ, which will alone prevail. And indeed, it will one day triumph as its principles take possession of the minds of men more and more every day. Now, this was written by Origen, who, by all accounts, was a highly pious man, incredibly intelligent. Um, but in his day, they had the belief that the church, the word, was going to spread throughout the world. Not that any Christian believes otherwise today. But what we need to understand is that the scriptures are quite clear that there will be a great falling away. That started happening, in my opinion, during the Enlightenment age, during that era and afterward. And of course, now religion, at least in the Western world, is all but dead. Now, there is a resurgence, there is a remnant, and the Bible says that that would happen as well. But we have to think about these things because our faith has been corrupted over the years. People basically don't look into these things themselves. They often just go to their spiritual or religious leaders, but they don't question. It works very much the same as we talk about trust the science. I don't believe that in any form of religious worship or gathering or whatever that someone has necessarily full supremacy over other people, whether they be the pastors or the bishops or whomever. That's not what Christ taught. What he taught was to serve others, and so the laity, the common people, they the ecclesia, they have to work with their leaders, their spiritual leaders. And the spiritual leaders have to work with the people. But the minute that there is a conflict that comes up, it cannot be, well, he's the authority. It cannot be that he's the authority. Therefore, what he says is true and correct and right. Christ also said that call no man your teacher on earth except for Christ, and no one your father except for the Father in heaven. So now, where there's quite literal teachings, I don't know. They seem to be, but there was an early church tradition of calling spiritual leaders your spiritual father and your teacher and other things like that. So it's one of those things where there seems to be a contradiction there. But I think in the overall uh, perspective of things, what Christ was saying is that ultimately go back to me and what I say, because that's what it's all about. It's all about Christ. It always is. The Old Testament and the New Testament all reflect back to Christ. All the early church writers reflect back to Christ. That is the pinnacle, the point in which we must remain. So if someone says something contradictory to that, we have to judge it by that standard. Anyways, let's get back to this text here. Um, but if all the Romans, according to this supposition of Celsus, embrace the Christian faith, they will then pray overcome their enemies, or rather, they will not war at all, being guarded by the divine power which promised to save entire cities for the sake of 50 just persons. For men of God are assuredly the salt of the earth. They preserve the order of the world, and society is held together as long as the salt is uncorrupted. And that's an important point, as long as it's uncorrupted. Well, we know there's a lot of corruption throughout the church. It's not just the Catholic Church; it's the Protestant evangelical churches. I don't know enough about the Orthodoxy for to have any understanding of corruption scandals there, but we know that there have been vast corruptions in the church. There's a whole religious denomination called Reformed theology, or it's not really denomination. There are multiple denominations that believe in Reformed theology, ideas set out by Calvin and his predecessors. And it is antithetical to anything and everything taught by the early church. You can read in Justin Martyr's First Apology, which I'll probably read after this, very directly, where he counteracts every point that modern Calvinists make, because what they believe is Gnosticism. They believe in some sort of secret knowledge. They believe in Stoicism. That's what Calvinism's all based in, because it's based in Augustinianism. So again, and Augustine is the guy who basically was like, oh, it's okay to war as long as you don't hate the person you're murdering in your heart. That's not, Christ said nothing of the sort. Replying further to those whom Origen calls the enemies of our faith, who required us to bear arms for the commonwealth and to slay men, he writes, none fight better for the king than we do. We do not indeed fight under him, although he requires it, but we fight on his behalf, forming a special army, an army of piety, by offering our prayers to God. And this is, the idea that Christians have to protect themselves or they'll be eliminated, in a way, is a blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. And I say that because you are supposed to trust that God will take care of you and carry you through. And again, guys, I'm not going to sit here and say I don't have conflict with this. I absolutely do. I have conflict with this. I say it all the time. Mess with my family. That I talked about last week how I had someone stole money from my daughter. I was extremely angry. I had to pray about it and let it go or whatever. I put a I put a big old dent in my front door because I was so mad. I punched it, not as hard as I could, but pretty hard. And you know, I prayed about it. I let it go. Things were fine, and then I found out like 2 weeks later, the guy that stole from my daughter died of an overdose. So, did I need to avenge myself? No, I did not. And for anyone wondering, I'm not suggesting that God killed him because he slighted me, but who knows? I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, the man killed himself because he was living that kind of life. In any case, and if Celsus would have us lead armies in defense of our country, let him know that we do this too, and that not for the purpose of being seen by men or vainglory, for in secret and in our own hearts, there are prayers which ascend from the priest on behalf of our fellow citizens and Christians, our benefactors of their country more than others. For they train up citizens and inculcate piety to the Supreme Being, and they promote those whose lives in the smallest cities have been good and worthy to the divine and heavenly city. Celsus also believed that wars are inevitable, of the suggestion that all the inhabitants of Asia, Europe, and Africa, Greeks and barbarians, all to the utmost ends of the earth, were to come under one law. He says, anyone who thinks it's possible knows nothing. Origen's reply here is a brief statement of his faith in God and in men. The problem is not one of biological necessity, but it is a psychological or spiritual problem, he says. We hold that it is the mind, there is no evil so strong that it may not be overcome by the supreme word and God. So basically, he's saying our faith in God will overcome this evil, even if evil overcomes us in this life. And I bring you back to the scriptures. Christ says that a man who doesn't hate his mother and father and brother and sister, yea or nay, even his own life, uh, is not worthy of me. Do not be afraid of those who can send you into bondage here in this life, that is passing and fleeting, but be afraid of the one who can send you into bondage for eternity. The same objection is met repeatedly with the answer from experience. In the first place, the Christians themselves had illustrated the possibility of freeing frail human characters from all the seeds of war. Their own transformation is the greatest evidence. Justin writes, that is Justin Martyr, we who hated and destroyed one another on account of their same different manners would not live with men of a different tribe. Now, since the coming of Christ, live familiarly with them and pray for our enemies and endeavor to persuade those who hate us unjustly to live comfortably to the good precepts of Christ. And we who formerly used to murder one another, do not only now refrain from making war upon our enemies, but also that we may not lie or deceive our examiners, willingly die confessing Christ. Even the lowest classes of society, according to Athenagoras, had proved such conversions were genuine and possible. Among us, you will find even uneducated persons and artisans and old women who, if they are unable in words to prove the benefit of our doctrine, yet by the deeds exhibit the benefit arising from the persuasion of its truth. They do not rehearse speeches, but exhibit good works. When struck, they do not strike again. When robbed, they do not go to law. They give to those that ask of them and love their neighbors as themselves. And Athenagoras, I'm not sure, I can't recall off the top of my head when he was writing, but I believe this is second or third century. So again, or late second century, early third century. So we're talking about 200s. So again, removed, but not so many centuries removed, right? Let me check on entropy real quick here, guys. All right. Got somebody watching over there. Um, in the second place, the Christians are arguing that wars were in, not inevitable, pointed to the general growth of peace in the empire. During that time, until the death of Marcus Aurelius, Rome was under the Pax Romana. This is a historically unprecedented time in Rome where they basically said it was the Roman peace because they weren't having large scale wars. This is also a time where the empire was sort of dwindling, and there were battles, mind you. But the Christians believed the Pax Romana existed because of their faith. They wrote about this. They believed that their prayers is what guarded the empire. And I do find it interesting again as the church begins to sort of shift and change. Um, it's right around the time after the time of Origen. Origen, if you guys don't know, was anathematized a long time ago, about 400 years after he lived. He was one of the most highly influential teachers in the church. Saint John Chrysostom was a student of his and has spoke highly about Origen, and his writings are highly influential to the church, at least the Orthodox Church, from my understanding. And the things that Origen talked about and taught influenced the church for some long period of time, yet he became anathematized. And I'll have to delve into that sometime in the future because, from what I understand, it's not completely clear why or how that came about, or if it was actually fully implemented correctly. But basically, the guy got into some speculation on the origins of the soul, the soul being preformed before uh, um, having a body, that kind of stuff. It gets into a lot of kind of things that were crossing into Gnostic style heresies. So again, though, I don't think that the guy. I think that he was a godly man. I don't think he had evil intentions or anything. I think he was just super smart and was just speculating. But it is worth noting that that he is not his teachings are not fully accepted by either the Catholic or Orthodox Church. And in fact, I'm not positive, but I think in the Catholic Church they removed the uh the anathema against him or something. I might be mistaken, guys. So do your own research. I'll talk about it some other time, I suppose. Um Any case, it says here in the second place, the Christians in arguing that war were not an inevitable point to the general growth of peace in the empire. Transformation was not merely attested in a few cases. According to the Christians, the case had been so numerous as to affect the whole average of society and to be already reducing the spirit and influence of militarism. Irenaeus said, now Irenaeus is one of my favorite writers because he's very humble in his writing. He's like, I'm not a learned man. He does repeat himself a lot, um, and could be more concise. But hey, I have the same problem, so who am I to judge him? But he's one of my favorite writers specifically because of his lineage, and we know that he was taught by Polycarp. We know that Polycarp was taught by John the Apostle. Uh, and so we can see in his writings in around 160s, 170s, something like that, maybe 180s. I forget what it is. So late second century, we can see that he has an unbroken lineage from the apostles. And that's very important. And it says here, the law of liberty, that is the word of God preached by the apostles throughout the earth, caused such a change in the state of things that these nations did from the swords and war lances into plowshares. And that goes back to the prophecy in Isaiah, and changed them into pruning hooks for repairing, or sorry, reaping the corn, that is into instruments for peaceful purposes, and that they are now unaccustomed to fighting, but when smitten, offer also the other cheek. See, Christ said that literally, guys. It wasn't just some suggestion. It is, says Tertullian to the emperor, the immense number of Christians, which makes your enemies so few, almost all the inhabitants of your various cities being followers of Christ. Um, Arnobius not only makes the same statement, but draws a lesson from it. And I think Arnobius is a contemporary of Irenaeus, if I'm not mistaken. I know he wrote pretty early on as well. But you guys are asking me, you're not asking anything, but I'm just saying I need to recall off the top of my head without looking it up, and you guys can expect me to remember every single little date. Sorry, I got too much stuff in my head. It would not be difficult to prove that after the name of Christ was heard in the world, not only were wars not increased, but they were even in a great measure diminished by the restraining of furious passions. For since we, a numerous band of men, as we are, have learned from his teaching and his law that evil ought not to be requited with evil, that it is better to suffer wrong than to inflict it, that we should rather send our own blood or shed our own blood than stain our hands and our conscience with that of another. An ungrateful world is now for a long period enjoying a benefit from Christ, inasmuch as by his means the rage of savage ferocity has been softened and has begun to withhold hostile hands from the blood of a fellow creature. And so, what he's making the point of here is that any sort of violence is evil in the eyes of God, and they will not do it. And so, from a moral philosophy standpoint, I question, what does your moral authoritarian stance, um, why is it superior to than someone else's moral authoritarian stance? So if I don't have Spook in the chat today, but if you had an Islamist who believes that their God is God and they have certain moral authority and certain laws that they have to put into place, what makes you right over them? I mean, at some point, we're just going to argue about the origins of our beliefs and that yours are nonsensical and mine are nonsensical or whatever, right? The difference in Christianity is 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 stark. It's important to understand this because it was a literally the religion of peace. It was about peace. And as the church grew, as it became established, as people as Christianity became more and more popular, as politicians became Christians, as it became in vogue and fashionable, it got more and more corrupt. I will often bring up the first anti-pope Hippolytus. Hippolytus uh, was elected as a second pope in Rome after I think it was Pope Victor. I can't remember. But after another pope was appointed, and he was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Those of you who have slaves, yeah, if you want to have sex with your slaves, it's fine. They're basically your wives. They're basically your concubine." And that was a heresy, guys. That might have been fine under the Old Testament, was not fine under the new law established in Christ. And so Hippolytus wrote against it. Um, that was, oh man, 200 something. Uh, you know, this stuff happened very soon, just like our government in the United States became corrupted very soon from its original state. But if all, without exception, who fed that they are men not in form of body, but in power of reason, would lend an ear for a little to his salutatory and peaceful rules, salutary and peaceful rules, and would not, in the pride of arrogance of enlightenment, trust to their own senses rather than to his um, adam, admonitions, the whole world, having turned the use of steel into more peaceful occupations, would now be living in the most placid tranquility, and would unite in blessed harmony, maintaining and violate the sanctions of treaties. Here it says, in fact, according to Origen, the whole Roman Empire was a league of nations divinely planned for the elimination of internal war. In the days of Jesus, righteousness arose in fullness of peace. It began with his birth. God prepared the nations for his teachings by causing the Roman emperor to rule over the world. There was no longer to be a plurality of kingdoms, else would the nations have been strangers to one another. And so the apostles would have found it harder to carry out the task laid on them by Jesus when he said, go and teach all nations. It is well known that the birth of Jesus took place in the region of Augustus, who fused and federated the numerous peoples upon the earth into a single empire. Now, he is speaking from this perspective because the Roman Empire did occupy most of the European landmass, part of northern Africa, and Asia Minor, or proper Asia, as it is known today in the West, the Middle East. They still had not spread all the way. Some people went out to the Orient, but they did not spread all the way out to India or China. I mean, they did, but it wasn't accepted fully. So when they talk about the world, they're talking about the Roman Empire, all of the Roman Empire. That's very specific and needs to be understood in that perspective, because you'll get confused with a lot of language, biblical language, and how these people were talking if you don't understand that the world for them was Rome and the surrounding areas. And so Rome was a multicultural and plural society, much like our modern Western society. It, we're Roman, guys. I mean, nothing's really changed. We have, some cultural advancements, some different things, but we are generally speaking Roman, all Europeans, especially those of us who can come from the British tradition. It's in our architecture. It says the plurality of kingdoms would have been an obstacle to the spread of the doctrine of Jesus Christ throughout the world, not merely for the reasons already mentioned, but also because the nations would, in that event, have been obliged to go to war in defense of their native lands. How then could this doctrine of peace, which does not even permit vengeance upon an enemy, have prevailed throughout the world, had not the circumstances of the world passed everywhere into milder phases at the advent of Jesus? And this is interesting because the sack of Rome was led by barbarian groups, those outside of Rome, who were Christians. Guess what? If you confessed you were a Christian to them, they would not kill you. They would let you go. This is how it worked. But at that time, that teaching came about that it was okay to kill people who weren't Christians, right? And what the church started doing, this is how it all started off, is they started saying, well, it's okay to condemn heresies and go after those people and to punish them and to do this and that. And they started making excuses. And then it became more or less a doctrine. And the doctrine of just war, by the way, is not a Christian doctrine. It is an Aristotelian doctrine. Plato and Aristotle are the ones who conceived of the just war doctrine. It's not a creation of Christianity. While claiming that the elimination of war was a human possibility, the Christians did not fail to appreciate their standards were both new and difficult, and thought of revenge as instinctive and a limitation of goodwill to those who love us in nature and universal. As Christ said, even sinners do good to those that do good to them. Our religion, says Tertullian. Tertullian is another one that I've been told was anathematized. I'm not really sure about his issues. I think that I have read some stuff about him that he did not accept. I think that Christ was fully also the Father. I think that was one issue that he had. But I was told this. I didn't even know this. I was told this by Michael Witkoff. Michael's an avid reader and an author, and of course, an Orthodox. If you aren't aware, he's got a YouTube channel called Brother Augustine. So Annie Gilmore says, some nonsense. Spam in the chat. Um, our religion, says Tertullian, commands us to love even our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us, aiming at a perfection all its own and seeking in its disciplines something of a higher type than the commonplace goodness of the world. For all love those who love them. It is particular to Christians alone, and to love those who hate them. And elsewhere, he declares Christ plainly teaches a new kind of patience when he actually prohibits the reprisals which the Creator permitted in requiring an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And you should know that. You should know that Christ was literal about those things, that you're not supposed to do that anymore. It's the first thing he opens up with after the Beatitudes. He says, you have heard from in the law that, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't do that. That's not the way to go. And that, again, you have to understand the Sermon on the Mount was a parallel to Moses on Mount Sinai giving the law, the 10 Commandments originally. Let's see. Lost my place here. Okay. And again, God certainly forbids us to hate even with a reason for our hating. For he commands us to love our enemies. And that's another thing, is that the early church talked about this a lot, that even our thoughts are sinful. I think your actions are most important, but you need to have control of your thoughts, to take every thought captive, as Paul the Apostle said. Take every thought captive. Another charge made against the Christians was that of disloyalty. This applied not only to their pacifism, but their whole opposition to idolatry and participation in civil duties. And this was a big part of being anti war, because in those days, you had to sacrifice and pay respects to the idols, the gods of the Romans while you were in the military. You had to give sacrifices for your commanders, all kinds of stuff. This applied not only to their pacifism, but their whole opposition to idolatry and the participation in civil duties. In spite of Paul's words about obedience to rules and Jesus' famous saying about rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, they did not interpret their duty as being unqualified obedience to the emperor. Exactly. Exactly. And this is where the SJWs get these things wrong. They want to try to make this render under Caesar thing about, oh no, if the government requires socialism, socialism's good, and God said provide for the poor and this and that. Jesus was a socialist. No, Jesus was not. He was an anti-materialist. Socialism is a materialistic philosophy. It predicates the idea that you will be happy with the more material things that you have, and because there is an unequal distribution of material things, you are unhappy. Now, I know it goes deeper than that. I know that they want to take care of the poor and all these other things. But the best way to do that is to enable those people, to empower them to work for themselves, to get their lives straight, and to help them out in those manners, not to just hand them money. We know this because when poor people who aren't good with money win the lottery, guess what? A year or two later, they end up poor again. It's because money management is a skill that you have to cultivate, just like most things in life. The precepts of loyalty to the state, when applied only. Hold on. I actually skipped a line here. For as Tertullian puts it, if all things are Caesar's, what will belong to God? Well, that's a pretty good point. The precepts of loyalty to the state applied only to cases where conscience showed no conflict with loyalty to God. In other cases, they preferred to obey God rather than men and to take the consequences. The plea of national patriotism, Lactantius meets familiarly with and squarely, refusing to the sayings of pagan writers, reckon the interest of the country as having the first place, he writes. And I believe, again, off the top of my head, just random, I believe we're talking to 300s here with Lactantius. When the concord of men is taken away, virtue has no existence at all. Actually, I just want to look that up because now that I said it, I don't want to be giving you guys misinformation. Well, see. All right. Well, let me. If I could spell. Aha. Oh my. Hold on. Is that right? Did I spell it right that time? Aha. Here we go. I just want to wiki or something, man. Sorry, guys. It's taking way too long. Ah. Uh. This is way too much work for a little date. Yes, 250 to 2 or 325. Okay. There we go. So late 200s. All that just to find that. Okay, sorry. The plea of national patriotism, Licentious meets fairly and squarely, referring to refusing to say, ref, referring to the saying of a pagan writer, reckon the interest of our country as having the first place. He writes, when the concord of men is taken away, virtue has no existence at all. For what are the interests of our country but the uh, inconveniences of another state or nation? That is, to extend the boundaries which are violently taken from others, to increase the power of the state, to improve the revenues, all which things are not virtues, but overthrowers of virtues. You guys should like this because the early Christian writers were very liberty minded, very much so. And you can tell just from that little statement. For in the first place, the union of human society is taken away. The abstaining from prosperity of another is taken away. Lastly, justice itself is taken away, which is unable to bear the tearing asunder of the human race. And whenever arms have glittered, must be banished and exterminated from thence. Thence. This saying of Cicero is true, but they who say, and is to be had regard is to be had to citizens, but that it is not to be had to foreigners. These destroy the common society of the human race. And when this is removed, benefices, libert- liberalities, kindness, and justice are entirely taken away. For how can a man be just who injures, who hates, who despoils, who puts to death? Yet they who strive to be serviceable to their country do all these things, for they are ignorant of what being serviceable is, who think nothing useful, nothing advantageous, but that which can be held by the hands. He's talking about, again, materialism, right? And this alone cannot be held because it must be snatched away. Here he's talking about basically the government's ability to tax and steal and to invade and all the things that, our nation does today. Anti-commie says, how do you think I got into the liberty sphere? It's really funny to me that Christian libertarianism is not bigger. In fact, I remember watching Gutfeld some years ago, back like way back when he was doing Red Eye with Crowder and all that back in the day on Fox, and he was talking about he doesn't understand Christian libertarianism. I'm like, what are you talking about? The entire Bible is basically Christian libertarianism, at least from someone not who didn't wasn't raised in a Catholic or Orthodox faith. It seems quite clear. Whomever then was gained from the country these goods, that is, who by the overthrow of cities and the destruction of the nations has filled the treasury with money and has taken lands and enriched his countrymen, he is extolled with praises to the heavens. In him there is said to be the greatest and perfect virtue. And this is the error not only of the people and the ignorant, but also of philosophers, who even give precepts for injustice, lest folly and wickedness should be wanting in discipline. And that's true too. Aristotle speaks quite clearly about slaves and how, slaves. Sometimes you'll get a slave that doesn't know that he's a slave, but he's obviously a slave because their people were conquered, and obviously they're inferior. Um, Let me check entropy real quick, guys. All right. Thus, Lactantius challenges the materialistic and la, 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 materialistic philosophy that intercepts national interest in terms of so-called military necessity. Yeah, think about all of the wars and money that we spend globally and all the people that we murder globally here in the United States because of wars and necessity. Again, what makes their belief just versus your belief that they shouldn't be doing it? When is it proper? When you have the opinion that oh, I believe that this is the right cause to go to war for. Well, those people believe that invading other countries and destabilizing the Middle East is a just cause for their larger global plans, and they. I can't speak for every single one of them, but the elites that run the world seem to all be part of a Gnostic cult, a satanic Luciferian style cult, and to them, they're completely just because their God demands that they do these things. So, again, I think that when we get in these conversations, I talk to people, I'm always like, yeah, but why are you morally right? Aside from God said so. That kind of answer for a guy like me who grew up with a father who's a minister my entire life in the church, had to go to church growing up, was not allowed to stay the night at someone's house on Saturday unless their family went to church. Didn't matter what church I went to, but I had to go to church. And the answers exist in the Bible. The answers exist in psychology, human nature. They exist in history. They exist in philosophy. They exist in the writings of the early church. But what I was taught my whole life, well, God says so. That doesn't work with me, man. And I don't think that works with God either. God is a loving and reasonable God, and he will provide logical answers. And this is also what the Calvinists do. They say, well, God said so. How dare you? How dare you question God's divine authority? Well, I'm not. I'm questioning your judgments of who God is and the character you make him out to be. And I do believe that the Calvinists make God out to be a cruel and evil God, and I don't think that that's the case at all. Why would you create such a magnificent universe and create life and do all the things that you did if you're evil, um, just for your own amusement, to send some people to eternal punishment and damnation because you, you feel like it, and you're the supreme being, so therefore you're right. I mean, that's that in essence. It's a bit of a straw man, but in essence, it is what the boiling down on what they believe. So, um, no, they'll tell you, no, we don't, not really, but it's not really true. They basically believe that God is the author of evil, that God punishes people unjustly, that God controls everything you do, that there is no such thing as free will. And again, all of this comes from Stoic fatalism, which is why I wanted to do a series on Stoicism and Christianity. But I think I'm going to continue with that, but I'm going to go about it in other ways, and maybe I'll do a very specific presentation on that. as I was doing before. But we'll have some answers in this when I get through this paper and we talk about Justin Martyr's first apology. One of the earliest apologies, by the way. I think the other week I mentioned that he was writing in potentially like the 120s or something like that, and I was mistaken. It's like 150 is what he's dated to. Um, but that's neither here nor there. It's not that big of a deal. Uh, I'm more here to present you guys with ideas, and accuracy is important. But again, I can't recall everything off the top of my head. So let's see here. It says, thus Lactantius challenged the materialistic and militaristic philosophy that interrupts national interest in the so-called military necessity. Even the plea of justice in retaliation of self-defense was heard and answered by the Christians. Lactantius said, it is not less the part of a bad man to return an injury than to inflict it. For he who endeavors to return an injury desires to imitate the very person by whom he has been injured. Meaning you're imitating an evil person who already committed evil against you. In evil doing, says Tertullian, there is no account taken of order, nor does place separate what similarity conjoins. Meaning, it doesn't matter if you started it and or you retaliated; it's still evil. It is not enough, writes Athenagoras, to be just, for justice is to return like for like. But it is incumbent on us to be good and patient of evil. So he makes the point, it is justice to return like for like, the balancing of the scales. But he says, but for us, we're not going to do it. We don't do it. We follow Christ's example. In treating now the reasons for the Christian opposition to war, considering the considerations of space, prevent any elaborate examination of those objections which were not to war itself, but to its accessories, its objectionable associations with numerous and serious. They are well summed up in Harnack's list, which, after naming the first objection which military service presented to early Christians, that it was war service and that Christianity rejected entirely war and bloodshed, adds the following. So Harnack, being another academic, mind you guys, this paper was written in the 1930s that I'm reading from, and it is linked in the description. So he has these points here. The officers had to occasionally to promote capital sentences, and the common soldier had to perform all that was ordered of them. Meaning that if a soldier, a centurion, or a legionnaire ordered you as as your superior to kill somebody, you must. And by the way, folks, if you didn't know, a Roman soldier could kill anybody. Now, if they killed someone who was a Roman citizen, they might be in trouble because Roman citizens had rights. They were protected. But if you were not a citizen, a Roman soldier could just put you to death and there was no questions asked. If I'm not mistaken, this is Archimedes was murdered accidentally by a Roman soldier. That guy got in trouble though. Um, but I forget why. I don't remember if he was insulted or whatever. But yeah, Archimedes. If you didn't know, we discovered not too long ago from an ancient manual, a book he wrote, found in a monastery that was bleached and written over, had developed a form of calculus 2,000 years ago. That is before Newton. So, pretty smart guy. The unconditional military oath confiscated with the unconditional obligation to God. The emperor worship nowhere was more prominent than in the army and was almost unavoidable for each individual soldier. So again, like I said, they had to worship the emperor. They had to pay dues. They had to burn incense. They had to kneel down. They had to offer prayers, sacrifices, those things, right? The officers had to offer sacrifices, and common soldiers had to participate in it. The military standard seemed heathen. Honoring them was therefore like idolatry. Likewise, the military honors, the Capulet, and Irenaeus talks about this, etc., appeared idolatrous. So this being a Capulet is a crown. This is referred to in the book of Revelations, and Irenaeus goes on at length about this and what the mark of the beast is and all those things. No, and there they all believe that it was the numbering meant the name, someone's name specifically of an individual would match that 666 number. The Paterists, of course, they all believe that all the things that come about from Revelations all happened within the first century, and it was probably written under the reign of Nero and yada yada yada. That's probably true to some extent. But I come from a historicist perspective, which I believe that Revelations has been unfolding for the last 2,000 years. So, I mean, it's just a different perspective, and it seems to be the case, which I'll talk about one day in the future. But they talk about this is the mark of the beast, or Irenaeus talks about taking offerings and offering them to people, or you won't be able to buy or sell, because this was in place in the day. So really, really understand this, right? That we live in a different kind of world. Now, I think, because I understand a little bit of Greek, that when they use the word arthropos, where we get our word anthropology, that number is the number of man, not a man. And my understanding is it can be translated both ways, though it never is. Even though there's a tradition that suggests otherwise, I don't know if that tradition is right. Now, I'm not the arbiter of, all things truthful in the Bible. It's something I have to figure out, and I'm trying to figure out. But I think that there's good textual evidence to suggest that it is talking about human beings. And the reason why it's the number of man is because man was born on the sixth day. And I believe that the six repeating is about our institutions, the institutions of our government, the institutions of our economy, and the institutions of our religion, because that's what Revelations is concerned with. It's what it's talking about. Antikami said, he defended Syracuse from the Roman takeover. Seems a good reason to die. You're talking about Archimedes. Yeah, is that what it was? I couldn't remember, man. But the soldier was not supposed to kill him, was the thing, and was in trouble, I believe, if I recall the story. The little bit I do recall, right? So, guys, I'm gonna read these last little 2 points here, and we're gonna stop for the day, and then I should be back Thursday, of course. So it says here the other 2 points are the conduct of soldiers in peace was opposed to Christian ethics, the extortion, lack of restraint. So that's what I was just talking about, more or less. And also the traditional rough play and jest in the army, the mime in the army, etc., were offensive in themselves and were associated in part with idolatry and heathen festivals. There is a lot of talk in the early church fathers, the Ante-Nicene fathers, about vain exercise, wrestling, stuff like that. I'm not saying they're wrong. I think that there can be good things with that. I think that rough play is actually good for a lot of reasons, but I understand their position again. So we're at page 18. So I might be able to get this done next Monday. Depends on how much I sidetrack. Let's read this page and then I'll close out here. The first ground for Christians' opposition to war itself was the very obvious likeness of war to murder. Not only the commandment of the Decalogue, that's the 10 Commandments for those who aren't aware, but the universal conscience of mankind was the ground on which the early Christians based this objection. Now, some of you may have been taught that the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, says you shall not murder means don't lie in wait. I don't know if that's true or not. What I do know is that Moses did not lie in wait and was attacked by a man. And when he struck him with a rock, it killed him, and he was considered a murderer and had to flee Egypt. So even the Old Testament suggests that self defense is murder. Now, again, this isn't a moral, legal objection I'm bringing up to our laws. I was in full support of Kyle Rittenhouse. I think he had every right under our laws and justice to do what he did. However, from a higher moral standard, a standard of Christ, I think that, you know, you shouldn't be killing people, period. Something like that. So, these both these things can be true. And that's why I always say, I try to take a pacifistic stance. I will not put that on other people. But regardless, this is what the church taught. And that's all I'm saying. This is what the church taught. They taught this for 400 years, more or less, and more so than less so. I don't really know any less so. And it didn't change really until Augustine. And it seems like when I talk to people and they go from the big faiths that have ancient ties, like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church. I never talked to any Coptic Christians, so that'd be interesting to speak with them about this. But they're more or less just Orthodox. Like they all go back to the 4th, 5th, 6th century or 7th century even, and I'm like, so you are practicing something that was established 400 years after Christ lived. What 500 years after Christ lived, 700 years after Christ lived. Those should not be your primary sources. It should be the people closer to the origins, to the teachings, to the lessons. And then all the debates about things that people debate about, like veneration of Mary, what is the Eucharist, stuff like that. You find as you go further and further along that the stuff that Protestants object to, generally speaking, are things that aren't really talked about or established until the 4th or 5th century, 6th century or beyond. It's really quite interesting. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that the transubstantiation of the Eucharist is not written about in the early church. It is, but it's written about differently by different writers. Very notably, is it Clement I'm thinking of? No. I was reading Clement of Alexandria the other day, but it wasn't him I'm thinking of. It is Justin Martyr, I believe. I think it maybe is, but it could be Clement. Anyways, regardless, they talk about the Eucharist not being changed into the body and bread of Christ, but taking it changes you into Christ. It's kind of a different perspective, right? So, and they literally use, in some cases, I think Tertullian uses the language. It is Tertullian uses the language, says specifically that it's symbolic. But again, there are these debates. I don't care to have these big debates about these things, but this one right here is very important, I think. Anti-commie coming in with those things. Archimedes made a laser? Sweet. And get him and Styropyro together. If you guys don't know who Styropyro is, he's a pretty interesting kid on YouTube, young gentleman who quite smart, has been messing with lasers and doing chemistry stuff for a very long time on YouTube. There's a renewal of the covenant post-Christ. I can't get to the date, but it doesn't codify militarism to tie it to the subject matter. Yeah, I'm not sure what you're talking about, Auntie. I'd have to look into it. I know what I know. I again, I base my beliefs as much as possible in the early church. I'm not saying they got everything right. This seems to be though something that they got right. Um, and the reason why I say that they didn't necessarily get everything right is because they disagree with each other. Not majorly, but there are disagreements. So, you know, you gotta take it for what it is. But that's one of the problems with tradition because tradition can change. It's why having something written down is important, and this is why I refer to these works as well as the scriptures. And I'm not a sola scriptura individual, although I think that it has primacy, right? So, anyways, I said I was going to read the rest of this. Let's do it. Not only the commandments of the Decalogue, but the universal conscience of mankind was the ground on which the early Christians based this objection. The current bimetallism of morals, which condoned wholesale slaughter but condemned individual murder, was frequently commented on. The whole world, writes Cyprian to Donatus, is wet with mutual blood and murder, which in the case of the individual is admitted to be a crime, is called a virtue when it is committed wholesale. Right. This is the taxation is theft argument. It's what it is. It's the same thing. Impunity is claimed for the wicked deed, not the not the plea that they are guiltless, but because the cruelty is perpetuated on a grand scale. Vitantus says, if anyone has slain a single man, he is regarded as contaminated and wicked, nor do they think it lawful for him to be admitted to this earthly abode of gods, that is, the temples. But he has slaughtered countless thousands of men, has inundated plains with blood and infected rivers. It is not only admitted to the temple, but even into heaven. If this is the virtue that renders us immortal, declares Lactantius, I, for my part, should prefer to die rather than become the cause of destruction to as many as possible. And again, when God forbids us, he only prohibits us from open violence, which is not allowed even by the public laws, but he warns us against the compulsion of those things which are esteemed lawful among men. Therefore, with regard to this precept of law, there ought to be no exception at all, but that it is always unlawful to put a man to death whom God willed to be a sacred animal. And I like that he mentions animal. This is something I've argued with my dad for years. Tries to suggest that ancient people didn't believe that human beings were animals. They absolutely did. Um, they absolutely did, but they thought us special as we are. But just because we are animals doesn't mean that we don't have a part of divinity to us. And a big part of that is our reasoning, right? Or rationality. This is in part why Christ is the logos, the reason and the purpose. Another cause of the early church or early Christian pacifism was their strong sense of brotherhood, not with their fellows, but with foreigners and aliens. They rose above national divisions. We acknowledge, writes Tertullian, one all-embracing commonwealth, the world. Yeah. The letter to Diognetus says Christians are not distinguished from the rest of mankind either in locality or in speech or in custom, for they dwell not somewhere in cities of their own, neither do they use some different language nor practice an extraordinary manner of life. They dwell in their own countries, but only as sojourners. So this again goes back to this idea of Christian libertarianism, by the way. They bear their share in all things as citizens, and they endure all hardships as strangers, meaning they'll be good citizens, good neighbors in their community, but they're strangers because they're not as the thing was in the early 2000s of this world. Not of this world. They're for the next world. Every foreign country is a fatherland to them, and every fatherland is foreign. This cosmopolitanism had in the Christian church a deep religious basis. It was the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. And Christ declared Paul, there is no difference. And the philosophic democracy of his sermon at Athens rings out again in such a passage as from Lactantius. For if we all deserve our origin from one man whom God created, we are plainly of one blood. And therefore we must be considered the it must be considered the greatest wickedness to hate a man even though guilty. On which account God has enjoined that enmities are never to be contracted by us, but that they are always to be removed so that we soothe those who are our enemies by reminding them of their relationship. Likewise, if we are all inspired and animated by one God, what else are we than brothers? And indeed, the more closely united, because we are united in soul rather than in body. Accordingly, like Luck, whatever the name is, Lucretius, yeah, Lucretius, does not err when he says, "In short, we are all sprung from a heavenly seed, all that have that same Father. Therefore, they are to be accounted as savage beasts who injure man, who, in opposition to every law and right of human nature, plunder, torture, slay, and banish. On account of this relationship of brotherhood, God teaches us never to do evil, but always do good." Tertullian, in one of his few passages where appeal to sentiment, uh, pacifist appeal to sentiment, reminds the soldiers of what his victory means. This is the laurel of triumph made of leaves or of corpses. Is this laurel of triumph made of leaves or of corpses? So the question is back in the day they used to get their laurels on their head, the gladiators, Olympians, stuff like that, soldiers even, and he's saying, this is you're being honored for the dead bodies. You're being honored for the people that you murder, and it's adornment with ribbons or with tombs. It is bedowed with ornaments or with the tears of wives and mothers. It may be of some Christians too, for Christ is also among the barbarians. And I'll leave it there. That puts us right at page 20. So I got about 10 pages left. So let's go over here with anti-commie. Let's see. So I think you were talking about this when I was talking about Moses. Yeah, there was a renewal of the covenant post Christ. I can't get to the day. Okay. Oh, and I concur. I can't lay it out, and it would derail you, LO. I just knew that there was a renewal of the covenant from the original one. Make of that what you will, Catholic or Protestant. Okay. Um, Aristotle says tripartite soul. Yeah, well, when you get into the apologies, so Justin Martyr was I believe, he was potentially a lawyer. He worked in that capacity, but I could be wrong. But he was for certain a philosopher, and he came to understand Christianity through philosophy, and he lays this out. And it's really interesting because you'll see this over and over and over again in the early church. They'll talk about how the philosophy of the Greeks allowed the idea of Christ to be presented in this time, and that the philosophers were getting to this notion of a thing just by pure reason. Now they didn't quite get it right, but of course, whether you believe it or not, God or not, the very idea that God would form Himself into a human body and limit Himself is quite astounding. And I don't think they had this conception, right? They had similar conceptions, if you would, with their ancient heroes. But again, when we get to Justin Martyr, I really do want to read his first apology because it's not too long. and it's really good. And in fact, if I were to inculcate anyone into the faith, it probably would be the first thing, aside from scriptures, that I would have them read, because it is a whole account of what the faith is, what people believed, and you'll see interesting tidbits that in there. About 100 years after Christ walked the earth, that the church believed, including the fact that one gentleman he mentions went out to find a surgeon to make him a eunuch. But I guess because of his age, it was forbidden. Usually people were made eunuchs when they were children still. And that was so that he could remain celibate. So people took it pretty seriously, unlike today. Um, and I do have Aristotle's On the Soul anti-commie, but it's been so long since I've looked at it that um, I don't recall that. But the tripartite soul thing is something that is lost altogether in most modern churches. I know for a fact that the Calvinists don't teach it. They don't even understand that soul and spirit aren't the same word. They don't understand that the ruah and the nefesh are different things, or the pneuma and the oh, now I can't think of my can't think of my Greek. And the pneuma and the suke. So and these are different things, very specifically, very different things, and they're a reflection of our imaging of Christ, or imaging of God. But our imaging of God is beyond that. It's interactions. And when the book of Genesis says that we are made in the image of God, what it really says is that we can be imagers. We can bring a part of God into this earth through ourselves. And that's what we should really strive to do. And some of the arguments made in that paper that I'm reading from the early Christians were exactly that. If the argument against Celsus, if everyone were to be imagers of God, I know it's utopian, and I know it's not scriptural that this will happen, but I'm saying if everyone would be, then the world would be in peace. Period. But the world isn't in peace because it is under the control of evil, but God permits it for the greater good. That's kind of the idea, right? God permits it for our purification. God permits it for um, our choice of how we want to live. Those kind of things, right? But I'm not going to go off into a whole thing on you know the nature of God and philosophical musings on that. So, in any case, guys, thanks for being here today. I'll be back Thursday at 4 p.m. We'll be talking about diet stuff. I should be back, I hope. I should be starting this job this week, so we'll see how it plays out. But should be back talking about that. And then on Friday, uh, um, what was I talking about last Friday? Whatever. I don't remember. Whatever I was talking about last Friday is probably what I'll be talking about this Friday. So I'll get it brought up. Apparently, I didn't get enough sleep last night. So what's new? In any case, guys, thanks for being here. Thanks for your chat, your contributions. Um, and I'll see you all around. This has been AllMinusOne. My name is Bill, and I wish you all well.